All right, in our next chapter on the nervous system, we're going to look at the spinal cord and spinal nerves. I love some of these pictures I found, and this one especially. This is an intact nervous system of the human body. Now you can see these nerves are getting very, very small as you get out to smaller areas of the body. There's your brain and your spinal cord, and we'll continue to talk about each of those and some really cool things about the structure and function of them as we proceed through this chapter. So just a reminder, the central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system are all of the nerves that run to and from the brain and the spinal cord. So the spinal cord has several functions, one of which is it serves as a link between the brain and the rest of the body. So sensory input from the body comes in through the spinal cord up to the brain. Motor commands from the brain go down through the spinal cord and out through the peripheral nerves to the body. So it's a connection between the body and the brain. In addition to that, the second image on the page shows you an illustration of another function of the spinal cord, and that is to serve as a reflex center. So reflexes are involuntary, rapid, predictable responses to a stimulus. For instance, if you step on something sharp, you're going to withdraw your foot very quickly away from that stimulus. That's a reflexive action. Now, that is processed through the spinal cord before that information ever gets to your brain. So basically, your spinal cord helps you to start moving away from that painful stimulus before your brain ever gets the information that there is a painful stimulus. But again, guys, everything that happens with the nervous system is very, very fast. So we don't detect that slight delay in getting the information to the brain. When we examine the gross anatomy of the spinal cord, first of all, we need to realize just where it's located. So we know it is posterior, and it is actually an extension of the brain stem. So it begins at the medulla oblongata and runs through the vertebral canal. Remember, all of your vertebrae have that big hole that is the vertebral foramen, and that is what the spinal cord runs through. Now, you can see here the superior part, so this is the cerebellum, and of course the brain stem becomes the spinal cord once it goes through the big hole in the occipital bone. Do you remember what that is? That is your foramen magnum. Good. I knew you knew that. Now, so this is the superior part of the spinal cord, and this is the distal part of the spinal cord. So near the end of the cord, it actually comes to a pointed little area called the conus medullaris. So it's sort of like a cone, or comes to a point near the middle portion of the spinal cord. Now, we're going to look a little bit more at that in just a few minutes, but the typical adult spinal cord is about 3/4 of an inch in diameter and somewhere around 16 to 18 inches in length on the average adult. Now, it is shorter than the vertebral column, and a couple of things to add here. When we look at a cross section through the spinal cord, you see this little depression right here? Well, that's on the anterior aspect, and then there's another one here on the posterior. We call those the posterior and anterior median sulcus or fissure. A fissure is a deeper groove, so typically we call the anterior a fissure because it is deeper, and the posterior, because it is more shallow, is referred to as a sulcus. Just as you saw when you learned the different types of vertebrae and their location, we name the spinal cord by those same names. So the cervical part of the spinal cord is the upper part. Then we have the thoracic, the lumbar, and the sacral. Now there are two areas that are widened or enlarged a bit. You see it here pretty obviously in the cervical area, and a little bit here in the lumbar area. These are just simply called cervical and lumbar enlargements. Now, this is because there's a greater number of neurons in these areas, because remember, the cervical enlargement has to innervate the upper limbs, your arms. The lumbar enlargement has to provide for the neurons that innervate the lower limb. So since there are more neurons coming in and out of the cord at that area, we have the enlargements. When you see images of spinal nerves going in and out of the spinal cord, like you see here, or if you see the image that we started all of this with, the image of all of the nerves and the brain and the spinal cord from the cadaver, the nerves that you saw running in and out of body structures to the brain and spinal cord, that's not a single cell. That is a cluster of axons that are wrapped up in a cable-like bundle, just like when we studied muscle. When you think of a muscle, that is not a muscle cell. That's a bundle of fascicles, and every fascicle is a bundle of muscle cells. So we use the same terminology pretty closely to name our quote-unquote nerves. So let's begin looking right here at the smallest component. So this is the axon. Here's another. These are axons of one neuron, which is a nerve cell. Now, each one of these axons is going to be wrapped in a covering called an endoneurium. That sounds a little like something we've talked about before. Remember the endomysium, endo, inside, eum, cover or sheet, and we had mys, which meant muscle. So all we're doing is swapping mys for neuro, because neuro means nerve. So each individual cell structure, this is the axon of a cell, is wrapped in an endoneurium. Now we bundle a lot of axons together, just like we did with muscles, to form a fascicle. The fascicle is wrapped with connective tissue called a perineurium, and then we bundle a bunch of fascicles together and surround that with connective tissue called an epineurium. This is a nerve. This is what you see when you look at images of nerves. This is a nerve. Okay, so the nerve is a bundle of fascicles, and your fascicles are bundles of axons. We have 31 pair of spinal nerves coming in and out of the spinal cord, and their names begin with the first letter of the region of the spinal cord where it attaches. For instance, T7, that is the 7th nerve in the thoracic T region. So let's look a little bit more at these spinal nerves now. When the nerves are coming in and out of the spinal cord, we have several different structures that we need to examine. First of all, these little rootlets you see coming directly in and out of the spinal cord, they are going to merge to form the roots. So the root is the wider and larger part that is created where the rootlets merge together. Now, the posterior root that we see right here has an enlarged area called the posterior or dorsal root ganglion. This is where the cell bodies are located. So it's this enlarged area right here that you see, this blue neuron. This is where the cell bodies are located of that particular root. Now these are sensory neurons, so they are bringing information in to the spinal cord. Okay? Now, the anterior root has anterior rootlets. They merge to form the anterior root. These are motor neurons. Remember, motor causes an action. So your sensory neurons are bringing sensory information in to be processed. Your motor neurons are taking commands out to effectors to cause something to happen. Muscles contract, glands secrete, whatever. Okay? So I wrote in this, and I apologize for it looking a little wonky there because I had to draw the letters with my mouse. But your posterior root, posterior starts with a P, and then we have another word that means posterior, sort of loosely means posterior, that's dorsal. And your posterior or dorsal root carries sensory neurons. Okay, we're going to tie this together. Give me just a moment. Anterior also means ventral in the human, right? So your anterior or ventral root contains motor neurons. So here's your silly memory trick. Pointy A, pointy V, pointy M. Pointy letters all go together. Curvy, curvy, curvy. Curvy letter all goes together. Okay? So anterior, ventral, that's motor nerve. Posterior, dorsal, that is your sensory nerves. Now, notice right here, the motor and sensory, the dorsal and the ventral, your anterior, posterior, whatever name you prefer, right? They merge. You can see it really well over here on the left side. You can also see it here on the right. That is where the spinal nerve begins. These are the roots. This is the nerve. Now, because there are motor and sensory neurons in that nerve, they are what we call mixed nerves. Now, some nerves in the body are just sensory. They bring information in to be processed. Some are just motor. They carry out commands for action. But all of your spinal nerves have both, so they are referred to as mixed nerves. I mentioned previously that the spinal cord is shorter than the vertebral column. So the spinal cord actually ends at L1, lumbar vertebrae number 1. But the roots of the lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal spinal nerves extend inferiorly from a pointed little area right here that we call the conus medullaris. Now, they will exit at the appropriate location and go out to the body parts that they serve, okay, in and out, right? Now, these roots that you see here form a structure that looks very much like a horse's tail. Caudal means tail. Equine means horse.